In today's video, we're going to look at two new plugins that came out just last week. The first one is Astrometry Delay from Audio Brewers, which is an immersive tap delay with a couple of innovative twists. And the second one is Sidetrack from Novonotes, the makers of the 3D Audio Panda 3DX. And Sidetrack is interesting because it allows you to turn your iOS device, like an iPad or an iPhone, into an external digital signal processor. It allows you to take the audio units that you have on your iOS device and integrate them into your digital audio workstation, which is really interesting. Now, Sidetrack is not necessarily a plugin I would usually review on this channel, simply because we are focusing here on immersive audio, and Sidetrack really is meant for only stereo production. However, Novonotes, the makers of Sidetrack, is a company that creates a lot of plugins that I use regularly, so I felt it makes sense to also review that one. And we're also going to use that in connection with the Audio Brewers plugin in order to turn the iOS version of Astrometry Delay into something that we can use in Ableton. Now, if you're interested in one or the other, I'm going to leave some timestamps in the description below so that you can jump ahead in case you're interested in only one and not the other. And with that being said, let's get started. Couple of disclaimers before we start. First of all, Audio Brewers provided me with a free license to their Astrometry Delay plugin. However, everything that I'm going to talk about today is strictly my own opinion, and nobody saw this video before it is being released. The Sidetrack plugin, however, is something that I actually purchased myself. Second, reviewing Audio Brewers plugins is a little bit of a challenge because Audio Brewers are doing such a great job in making walkthrough videos about their own plugins. If you're interested in the details about how exactly the Astrometry Delay works, I highly recommend watching their walkthrough video. I'm going to leave a link in the description below. Now, in order to add value to that walkthrough, what I'm going to do in this particular video is I'm going to focus on a couple of additional ideas and thoughts. In particular, I'm going to focus on how to optimize the use of this immersive audio plugin in a stereo digital audio workstation, in particular in Ableton. And third, because the Sidetrack plugin from Novonotes only works on a Mac, I'm going to work on a Mac today. However, everything that I'm going to talk about with respect to the Astrometry Delay plugin works in Windows in exactly the same way. So if you're on Windows, there should be no problems at all. And with that being said, let's hop over to our Ableton session. So here we have a very simple Ableton session. It consists of basically one loop. This loop is actually part of the core library that comes with Ableton Live. It is a conga loop, so let's have a listen. Now, I chose this loop specifically in order to give you guys a good impression of what exactly the tap delay is doing. And what we're going to do now is we're simply going to drop an instance of the Astrometry Delay on our track and see what it does. So let's take the Astrometry Delay, let's drop it on here. The user interface opens up. Now, the user interface looks a little bit daunting at first, but it's actually fairly straightforward. You have 8 tabs that you can work with. And you can essentially move each tab in 2 directions. Up, down means the loudness. So if you move it up, it becomes louder. If you move it down, it becomes quieter. And left, right means the timing. So if I move it to the left, it is a short tap. If you move it to the right, it is a long tap. The timing can be done either by syncing to the DAW. So here we have from a 64th triplet to all the way down to 2 bars. Or we can also do that by time, by simply clicking on the time button here. And that will essentially then allow me to specify the timing with the number of seconds or milliseconds or whatever. And I can do that for each tab individually. So I can choose, for example, some tabs that are synced to the DAW, others are not, and so forth. Now, the way this is read or has to be read is that these tabs are currently in sequence. So essentially they're coming one after the other, meaning that if tab number 2, for example, says that this is a 30-second triplet, this means that it's coming a 30-second triplet timing after the first tap. So kind of this connection indicates that the measurement here is after the first tap. I can actually select it differently, so I can disconnect it by simply clicking on this button here, and that will then disconnect it and make the timing with respect to the original sound. And I can do that for each of the tabs individually. For example, I can start like 2 chains, one chain from tab 1 to tab 4 and one from tab 5 to tab 8 by simply kind of taking the 5th tab and kind of deselecting that here, and that will then essentially create 2 tab lines. And that's actually fairly neat already. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do is we're going to simply remove most of them because they are going to be a little bit in the way in order to understand what's actually happening. And for that, I have these plus and minus buttons here. Minus just means that I'm removing these tabs, and plus means that I'm essentially adding them again. So let's just remove everything until the first one. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply move that back to essentially here at the beginning and maybe just as close to the original sound as possible. And then I'm going to also set the feedback to 0, and that should essentially give me a sound that is very, very close to the original because the tap is happening almost instantaneously. So let's just play our sound. Now, if I move this tab now to the right, essentially kind of the delay kicks in. So essentially, if I move that, and for that, let me kind of switch that back to the DAW tempo. I have all the typical controls that you have. You have a mix knob, so I can either listen to the dry signal or the wet signal only. I have a feedback knob here. And as I said before, I can add additional tabs. So what I can do, for example, is I can add a second tab. And let's maybe do an 8th. I have a couple of spatial controls down here, so I can essentially move the entire sound field if I like. I can move it horizontally. That would essentially rotate everything horizontally. Or I can move it vertically if I want. And that by itself is already pretty neat. However, where the innovation comes in is essentially in the way these tabs are working. And the basic idea is that every tab is located at a particular position in the three-dimensional sound space, and this position is called the sound spot. And this sound spot is allocated randomly. However, you can change that. So let's have a brief look on how to actually do that. So let's play our sound again. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the second tab again in order to make things a little bit clearer. And what I can do now is I can put the mix completely to wet, and as soon as I do that, you see that the tab is coming from a particular location, which is essentially underneath me to the right, a little bit behind me to the right. And if I don't like that particular position, I can click on this recalculate button here. That would reposition the sound spots. If I click on that, you will see that this is actually moving into a different location. And I can continue doing that until I found a location that I like. And I can do that for each individual tab. So I can also do that for the second one. Let's bring the wet signal in again. Now there are two more things that I can do. If I want to reconfigure the entire sequence of tabs, I can also do that with this recalculate constellation button that will essentially recalculate the sound spots for each individual tab simultaneously. So if I click that, it will essentially move that around. So if I click again, it's going to recalculate that again. And then I have this big button here, which is the dynamic constellation button. And what that does, it kind of gives it a little bit of a movement. And it's a little bit difficult to hear, but we're actually going to do a little bit of a visual experimentation a little bit later where we're actually going to see how that works. But it is essentially moving the sound spots around a little. Now, if that movement is not enough for you, you also have modification options here. So you can include modifiers. If you click here, you have these additional modifiers. So what you can do, for example, is you can, let's kind of choose one modifier, the first one. And you can assign that to the feedback. Whenever you see these four little circles here. That means that you can assign the modulators to that particular parameter. So if I'm clicking here on the first button, it's going to essentially change the feedback according to that modifier. And then there's one more thing that I didn't show you yet, and that is the viscosity. And for that, let's maybe kind of take the second tab off, because that makes it a little easier to understand. Now, this viscosity setting essentially means that you can change how quickly any change in the parameters of the tap delay is going to have an effect on the audio. So currently, viscosity setting is set to 0. That means that whenever I move that around, it's changing that instantly. What I can do is I can increase that viscosity. This is then seen through this curvature in the connection here, maybe to 100. And what that will do is it will essentially smoothly approximate the movement in case I move the position of the tab into a different location on that user interface. So let's kind of take that and move that, or bring that closer. Or further away. So as you see, the effect is not reacting instantly. Instead, it is taking a little bit of time, and that gives a very interesting effect. So let's bring that back to our setting here. And let's add our second delay. And maybe kind of bring the feedback down. That's a little bit much. Okay, that's really nice. However, there's one particular issue, and that is that the location of the sound spot is not particularly obvious in the stereo version of the Astrometry delay. If you watch the walkthrough from Audio Brewers, they're actually working with the Ambisonics version of that particular delay. And in the Ambisonics version, what you can do is you can add an energy visualizer after the Astrometry delay, and that energy visualizer will then give you a very, very clear understanding of where exactly that sound spot is. And unfortunately, we can't really do that in a stereo DAW. However, in Ableton, we can actually create a workaround. We can actually do that, and this is what we're going to do next. But first, let me give a brief shout out to awesome new channel members, Eric and Tom Schrödner. Thank you so much for your support. This is really greatly appreciated. If you want to support this channel like Eric and Tom, there are a couple of things that you can do. First of all, you can simply hit the subscribe and like buttons. This is always an option. And then you can become a member of this channel, either through YouTube or through Patreon. You can follow one of the affiliate links in the description below, or you can go to the merch store and pick up one of my new merch items, like for example, this coffee mug. And if you want to know what the story behind this tagline, "In immersion we find presence," is, I invite you to watch my most recent videos where I talked about the use of artificial intelligence in the creative disciplines, because this, believe it or not, is actually a tagline that has been created by artificial intelligence. And with that being said, let's return to our regular programming. So let's change our setup to include an energy visualizer, an Ambisonics energy visualizer, which will allow us to visualize where exactly the tabs are and how they affect the overall three-dimensionality of the sound. Now, the way we're going to do that is with a simple trick that I used in a couple of other videos previously. I'm going to leave some links in the description below. We are going to use the Envelope for Life system in order to turn Ableton into an Ambisonics capable DAW, and we are going to then use simply an Ambisonics plugin in order to visualize the Ambisonics signal that comes out of the Astrometry delay. All the tools that we're going to use for that are completely free. You can just go to the website and download them, and I'm going to leave a link in the description below. And we're actually not even going to use the entire Envelope for Life system. We're just going to use these additional custom devices that have been developed by Noah Neumark, and I leave a couple of links in the description below where I'm talking about those in a little bit more detail. For this particular project, all we really need to know is that we can download them for free and just add them to our project. So let's go. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm simply going to delete the Astrometry delay here, because I'm going to recreate that or rebuild that. And what we're going to do is we're going to turn that track that has the congos on it into an Ambisonics track, and we're going to do that with the help of the Envelope for Life system. So go to the library or go to the folder wherever you have these Max for Life devices located. In my particular case, I put them in a folder that is called here PACS. And what we're going to do is we're going to once again not use the actual Envelope for Life system. What we're going to do is we're going to use these extensions. There are essentially three devices that we need. We need the audio ejector device, we're going to need the master bus device, and we're going to need the VST loader device. Once again, I'm going to leave links to those devices in the description below. So the first thing I'm going to do is we're going to take an audio injector device and we're going to drop that on our track. And what this audio injector device does is it takes essentially the stereo signal that comes out of that particular loop, and it's going to forward that into a 16 channel track that is used as an Ambisonics track within Ableton Live. And this 16 channel track is routed through Max for Live. So it doesn't go through the regular Ableton routing system, it actually goes through Max for Live. Now, in order to be able to hear that, what we need is we need to catch it at some location and return it into the regular routing system of Ableton, and this is done with the master bus device. So what we're going to do is we're simply going to drop the master bus device on a new audio track here, and this master bus device then essentially simply takes these 16 channels really, and it converts them back into a stereo signal, and you can choose what decoder you're going to use. Now, because we are actually not having any decoder right now, I'm going to simply select no decoder as the option for the moment, and let's just see if everything works. And I'm just going to press play here. And as you can see, everything is working correctly. So what's happening now is that the Ableton is essentially taking, and maybe I should kind of take that down a little. Oopsie, so I need to take that down here. And what is essentially happening here is that Ableton is taking left and right channel, is moving that into the first two tracks or first two channels of the 16 channel track, is then sent into Max for Live, and in Max for Live, it essentially is forwarded to the master bus device, and the master bus device catches that, and because there's no decoder, it's just going to take these two and it's going to forward that to the output, and that's where we are right now. Now, what I want to do now is I want to add the astrometry delay into this 16 channel track that is routed through Max for Live, and the way to do that is with the help of the VST loader device. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this VST loader device, I'm going to put that after the audio injector. These devices are going to connect. This is shown by this text here turning yellow and essentially saying that this is now routed into the chain. And then I need to select the VST that I'm going to use in this VST loader device. So I'm clicking on the load VST button. Then essentially the Finder window shows up and I need to select the actual plugin file. Now, for this to work correctly, I need to select a component. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the components and I'm going to select the Audio Brewers, where are we? AB astrometry component, and I'm going to open that up. And as soon as I'm going to open that up, you see that it has essentially understood that this is now the AB astrometry plugin that is loaded in here. There are a couple of additional things that I can do, and once again, if you're interested in how that actually works, I'm going to leave a link in the description below. Here we are not going to bother with any of the parameters. So what we're going to do is we're simply going to open up the user interface, and in the user interface you now see that the astrometry delay has understood that it is now on a 16 channel track. It is assuming that it's working in third order ambisonics, and the only thing I need to do is, because I actually don't really have a ambisonic signal, I just have a stereo signal coming in, so I'm going to switch the input to stereo. I'm going to leave the output to ambisonics, and then in order to actually hear something, what I need to do is I need to add a decoder, and for that purpose I'm simply going to use the decoder that comes with the Envelope for Live system. So I'm going to switch the decoder in the master bus device back to, I'm going to simply use the binaural third order decoder. You can choose whatever decoder you want, and we're actually going to use an Audio Brewers decoder a little bit later. And with that, now I should be able to hear everything again. So let's just play that again. So let's open it up. There's a lot going on right now, so let's just remove most of the tabs here, and let's maybe kind of put that back. I can take the feedback to 0, and let's put that where we have a nice tab going on. And as you can see, what's happening now is it's taking the stereo signal and it's turning that into an ambisonic signal. You see that here that all the 16 channels are active, and whatever is going out of the astrometry delay is now in ambisonics. And I can use simply an energy visualizer in exactly the same way that Alejandro did in the Audio Brewers video, where he kind of showed you how to use the energy visualizer in order to understand where exactly the energy of the tap is. Now, in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a second VST loader device. I'm going to put that after the astrometry delay device. And in this VST loader device, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an instance of the energy visualizer. So let's load that again. And the energy visualizer that we are going to use is the one that comes with the IEM plugins. Once again, links in the description. Also a free plugin, and that is, where are we? Here we have the IEM plugins, and what we want is we want the energy visualizer. So we're going to open it up. And we will open up the user interface, and now we have the energy visualizer, and we see sort of where the actual action is. So if we go into the plugin here, and let's just kind of move that mix to 100% wet. So essentially I see exactly where the energy of the tap is. So if I recalculate that, it's now in the back. And you see it sort of here now in the back. And that now allows me to work in exactly the same way Alejandro showed in his video, but in stereo in Ableton, without kind of doing a Ambisonics track in general. We're just using Ambisonics in order to essentially use the energy visualizer in our signal chain. Now there's one additional thing I wanted to do, and that is currently I'm using a different decoder in order to come back to a stereo binaural signal. If you're just using the astrometry delay as a stereo plugin, it will use the decoder that is built into the astrometry delay, but this is not what we're doing right now. Right now we are turning the signal into an ambisonic signal, then passing that on to the energy visualizer, and then passing that on to the decoder that is part of the Envelop for Life system. And that might give us a different impression, and we might not like that. But what we can do is, instead of using the decoder that is built into the Envelop for Life system, we can actually use the Audio Brewers decoder, the standalone decoder, in order to get in exactly the same audio that we would also get if we would just use the astrometry delay plugin by itself. Now, to do that is actually fairly straightforward. The only thing that you need to be aware of is that the decoder that we're going to use is the standalone decoder, and that does not come with astrometry delay. So if you want to do what I'm doing now, you need to purchase the decoder in addition to the astrometry delay. And the way to do that is very, very simple. Same thing that we did with everything else. We're going to take a VST loader device. We're going to put that at the end here. We're going to load the Audio Brewers decoder. So let's go to the components, and in the components, where are we? Here we are, the decoder. We're going to open that up. So that opens up the Audio Brewers decoder. Now we need to tell it that we actually want to decode it back to stereo. So you can select it here and kind of set that back to stereo, and that will essentially kind of kind of decode it back to stereo. And then the final thing we need to do is we need to once again switch the decoder in the master bus device back to no decoder, because otherwise we're decoding twice, and this is not what we want. So, and if we play the audio now, so let's go back to our track here. We are going to get exactly the same impression that we're also getting with the Audio Brewers plugin by itself. So the only thing we need to do is we probably need to bring in the dry signal again. So let me just open up here we are. This is here we are. And now we have exactly the same effect that we would also get if we would just use the astrometry delay as a regular stereo plugin, with the only difference that we can now see how the energy is located in our three-dimensional space. And that means that if we now kind of switch on the dynamic constellation button, our field should actually move a little, and we actually see that the tabs are moving around, and we're getting this three-dimensional impression of things that are moving just around, just a little bit, in order to give us a three-dimensional impression. And this is actually really, really cool. That's a very, very nice plugin. Very well done. Okay, so much to the Astrometry Delay as a regular plugin, and we are now going to turn our attention to the second plugin I wanted to talk about today, and that is SideRec from Novonodes. And once again, this is a plugin that allows us to integrate iOS devices into our digital audio workstation workflow. And the way we are going to do that, or the reason we are going to do this, we want to use the iOS version of Astrometry Delay, because there actually is an iOS version of Astrometry Delay from Audio Brewers. And we're going to use the iOS version instead, and we're going to integrate that iOS version into the Ableton Live session that we have here. And in order to make that happen, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to simply remove all the things that we have done so far. So we're going to go back to square one. So let's remove all these devices. Let's remove the master bus device. And then I think we also need to change the audio from Sense Only again to main, because as soon as you put an envelope for live device on a track, it will actually switch over to Sense Only. So let's see if we have the audio back. Yes, we do. Now, the basic idea is actually fairly simple. What you have to do is you have to add the SideRec plugin to our track. And what the SideRec plugin is going to do is going to send the audio through a USB connection to your iPhone or iPad, depending on what iOS device you use. It's going to process that on the iPhone and then essentially send it back into your digital audio workstation. That's actually working with very little latency. So let's go back to our plugins and let's select the SideRec plugin. So here we are. There are three types of those plugins. You can either use an audio effect, an instrument, or MIDI effect. And for this video, I'm going to use the audio effect because once again, we want to use the Astrometry Delay in the iOS version. So let's kind of move that over here. Now, as soon as I do that, it will open up as device not found. So the next thing I need to do is I need to connect my iPhone with my computer via USB, and I need to use the companion app that comes for iOS. That's a free app. And that will essentially then establish the connection. Be aware that it's a little bit kind of fiddly in terms of the type of cable that you're using. There was exactly one cable that worked for me. There might be an issue. And this is also the reason I can't do a screen recording here, because the cable that I used, unfortunately, was a cable that did not allow me to simultaneously record the screen of my iPhone. So to some extent, you need to believe me that this actually works. So let's open up the Duo application here. And as soon as I do that, I see the iPhone here as a selectable device. So let's select that, and then essentially I see the track that this is on. And what I can do now is I can simply add a plugin. Now, on my iPhone currently it doesn't show anything, and only once I select the plugin will it then essentially show me the plugin user interface. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the Astrometry Delay. And once again, this is the iOS version of the Astrometry Delay. So let's add that here. And as soon as I do that, I have the Astrometry Delay. I'm not quite sure if you can see that here on my iPhone. I'm going to do the same thing that I also did on the Mac version. I'm going to remove the tabs and just kind of have one tab at the very beginning. And let's play our sound. And what is happening now is, okay, the feedback, let's move the feedback back, that the sound is essentially passing through the USB cable to my iPhone. The iPhone is sort of an external digital signal processor, and I can use the iOS version of Astrometry Delay in order to kind of add the delay. So let me do kind of the same thing that I also did with we had an 8th double dotted. We can change the viscosity here. Viscosity back to 0, and that works just beautifully. Now this is actually quite interesting. This is an interesting solution. On the website they say there are a couple of reasons why you might want to do that. Maybe you have like a plugin or an instrument that you really like that you would like to bring into your digital audio workstation, and with this particular solution you can do that. It is not as straightforward to use, quite frankly, and let me just turn off the sound here. It is not as straightforward to use, kind of because there is just so many things that are going on here. So sometimes it will lose connection and then I have to reconnect and things like that. But In essence, it works actually quite nicely, and the latency, most importantly, is essentially very, very small. So this is actually kind of a very nice solution. So there are certain applications, I think, where this is useful, and it's nicely done. And it's interesting that they did that, because I don't think there's any other solution that allows you to do that, to turn your iOS device into a digital signal processor. So in conclusion, these two plugins that we looked at today, the first one, Astrometry Delay, I think is a really cool plugin. It's a really, really cool tap delay. I highly recommend checking that out. It's a lot of fun to work with. Like many Audio Brewers plugins, it has a little bit of a learning curve. So be aware that this is not a plugin that you can simply download and then just start doing things. You need to familiarize yourself with the individual things that you can do with it. You can very easily bring it to the point where the results that you're getting are not usable. So you need to kind of really understand what the individual controls are doing in order to use them properly. But once you've figured it out, the possibilities that you have are just so cool. And once again, if you are not able to work with a digital audio workstation that has Ambisonics track natively, like for example in Ableton, there are certain workarounds where you can essentially turn that into an Ambisonics track and then bring in something like the IEM energy visualizer in order to get a better understanding of what exactly the tap delay is doing in terms of the energy, the sound energy around the listener. Now, the second plugin that we talked about, the Side Rack plugin, is an interesting one. I see a lot of applications, but I'm not quite sure if a lot of people are actually kind of going for that, because it's really a fringe thing. If you need it, you know that you need it. If you don't need it, then you probably don't want it. It's once again, it's a really nice plugin, but kind of I see limited use, and there are certain use cases where this is useful. This was a lot of fun to play around with, but it's not necessarily something I would probably do on a regular basis, only if I want to really kind of do something. I could see that happening, for example, if you have something like a really interesting iOS instrument that you want to bring into your digital audio workstation, then obviously, but for what we did here, kind of using the iOS version of the Astrometry Delay, yeah, the kind of iOS version is cheaper, so you can kind of get away a little bit cheaper, but it's not as useful as having the plugin on your digital audio workstation directly. But this is really everything I wanted to say today. Let me know in the comment section what you think about those plugins. Are these plugins that you think could be useful? Are you already using them? I would really be interested to hear from you. And if you want to get into a deeper discussion, you can also join us on our Discord server. Once again, invite link is in the description below. And with that being said, see you at the next video.